Harold had 3 seconds to react when 1,400 pounds of enraged Mare charged directly at his chest. Her eyes wild with a fury he had never seen in 8 years of caring for her. The horse he trusted with his life was about to end it, and the sick foal lying motionless on the barn floor was the reason why. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun had barely begun to peek over the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky when Harold Benson, a 62-year-old farmer with weathered hands and a lifetime of experience with horses, walked toward his barn with a heavy heart. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh hay and morning dew, but Harold barely noticed. His mind was consumed with worry about what awaited him inside those wooden walls. For 3 days now, his youngest foal, a beautiful chestnut colt he had named Copper, had been growing weaker and weaker, refusing to nurse and barely able to lift his head. The veterinarian had come twice already, administering medications and giving instructions, but Copper's condition continued to deteriorate. What Harold did not anticipate, however, was that his attempt to help the sick foal would nearly cost him his life that very morning. Harold had been raising horses on his family's farm for over 40 years. His father had taught him everything he knew, and before that, his grandfather had worked these same fields, tending to generations of horses that had become as much a part of the family as any human member. The Benson farm was known throughout the county for producing some of the finest horses in the region, animals that carried themselves with grace and strength, reflecting the love and dedication poured into their care. But among all the horses Harold had raised, none had captured his heart quite like Bella, the giant chestnut mare, who now stood guard over her ailing foal in the main stable. Bella was no ordinary horse. Standing at 17 hands high and weighing nearly 1,400 pounds, she was the largest mare Harold had ever owned. Her coat gleamed like polished copper in the sunlight, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. Harold had purchased her 8 years ago from a breeder in Tennessee, and from the moment she arrived on the farm, she had established herself as the undisputed queen of the stable. The other horses respected her, and even the most stubborn stallions would yield to her presence. But it was her maternal instincts that truly set Bella apart. When she gave birth to Copper 4 months ago, Harold had witnessed something extraordinary. The way she cleaned her newborn, the gentle nickers she used to communicate with him, the fierce protectiveness she displayed whenever anyone approached too quickly. All of it spoke to a bond that transcended the ordinary relationship between mare and foal. The trouble had begun 5 days earlier, when Copper started showing signs of lethargy. At first, Harold thought the colt was simply tired from a particularly active day of running and playing in the pasture. But when Copper refused his morning feeding the next day, Harold knew something was wrong. The veterinarian, Dr. Martinez, arrived within the hour and diagnosed the foal with a severe respiratory infection. The treatment plan required administering medication directly to Copper, which meant separating him from Bella long enough to ensure he received proper care. What seemed like a straightforward task quickly revealed itself to be anything but simple. Bella had always been protective of Copper, but as his condition worsened, her maternal instincts intensified to a level Harold had never witnessed before. She would not allow anyone to approach her foal without positioning herself between them, her ears pinned back and her eyes blazing with warning. Even Harold, whom she had trusted for years, found himself on the receiving end of her threatening stance. The first time, Doctor Martinez attempted to examine Copper, Bella had lunged at him with such ferocity that the veterinarian barely escaped being trampled. They had managed to distract her long enough to administer the first round of medication, but each subsequent attempt had grown more dangerous. Now, On this particular morning, Harold knew he had no choice but to try separating Bella from Copper once more. The foal's condition had worsened overnight, and Dr. Martinez had called early that morning with urgent instructions. Copper needed immediate intervention, and the only way to provide it was to get Bella out of the way. Harold had spent the past hour devising a plan. He would use feed to lure Bella into the adjacent stall, then quickly close the gate between them, giving him enough time to tend to Copper. It seemed simple enough, and Harold had performed similar maneuvers countless times throughout his career. But as he approached the barn, a knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. The moment Harold slid open the barn door, he heard Bella's low, rumbling nicker. It was not a sound of greeting, but rather a warning, a message that she knew he was there and that she was watching. Harold moved slowly, speaking in the soft, calm voice he always used around his horses. "Easy, girl. Easy, Bella," he murmured as he made his way toward her stall. The interior of the barn was dim, the morning light filtering through gaps in the wooden slats and casting long shadows across the hay-covered floor. As his eyes adjusted, Harold took in the scene before him, and his heart sank. Copper lay on his side atop a thick blanket that Harold had placed there the night before. The foal's breathing was shallow and labored, his once bright eyes now dull and unfocused. The sight of him so helpless, so fragile, brought tears to Harold's eyes. But standing over Copper, like a giant sentinel refusing to abandon her post, was Bella. Her massive body blocked any approach to the foal, and her head swung toward Harold as he stepped closer. The whites of her eyes were visible, a clear sign of her agitation, and her nostrils flared as she took in his scent. Harold had brought a bucket of sweet feed, Bella's favorite, hoping to use it as a distraction. He held it up, letting the familiar smell waft toward her. "Come on, Bella," he coaxed, taking a step toward the adjacent stall. "Look what I have for you." For a moment, Bella's attention seemed to waver. Her ears flicked forward, and she took a tentative step toward the bucket. Harold felt a spark of hope. Maybe this would work after all. Maybe he could get her into the other stall and close the gate before she realized what was happening. But as he continued backing toward the adjacent stall, Bella suddenly stopped. Her head whipped back toward Copper, and in that instant, Harold saw the decision form in her eyes. She was not going to leave her foal. Not for food, not for anything. And anyone who tried to make her would face the full force of a mother's wrath. Harold froze, his hand still outstretched with the bucket of feed, as he watched the transformation take place before his eyes. Bella's entire body seemed to swell with protective fury. Her muscles tensed beneath her gleaming coat, and she lowered her head in a posture that Harold recognized all too well. It was the stance of a horse preparing to charge, to defend, to fight with every ounce of strength she possessed. In that moment, Harold understood that he was no longer dealing with the gentle mare who had nuzzled his hand for treats countless times over the years. He was facing a mother whose sole purpose was to protect her offspring, and nothing would stand in her way. The bucket slipped from Harold's fingers, clattering to the ground and sending sweet feed scattering across the barn floor. The noise startled Bella, and she reared up on her hind legs, her front hooves pawing at the air in a display of raw power that took Harold's breath away. He stumbled backward, his boots catching on a loose board, and he fell hard against the wooden wall of the stall. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he barely registered it. His eyes were fixed on Bella as she came down from her rear, her hooves striking the ground with enough force to shake the entire structure. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Harold pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain Bella could hear it. The mare stood over Copper, her breath coming in great huffs that sent clouds of steam into the cool morning air. Her eyes never left Harold's face, and in them he saw something that chilled him to his core. It was not aggression, not exactly. It was desperation, the wild, primal fear of a mother who believed her child was in danger and who would stop at nothing to keep him safe. Harold had spent his entire life around horses. He had broken wild stallions, calmed spooked mares during thunderstorms, and nursed countless animals back to health from injuries that would have killed lesser creatures. But he had never felt truly afraid of a horse until this moment. Bella was not just any mare. She was a force of nature, 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone, driven by an instinct older than humanity itself. And right now, that instinct was telling her that Harold was a threat. Slowly, carefully, Harold began to edge along the wall toward the barn door. He kept his movements small and deliberate, never taking his eyes off Bella. "Easy, girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own ragged breathing. "I am not going to hurt him. I am trying to help." But Bella did not understand his words. All she knew was that a human was in her space, near her sick foal, and every fiber of her being was screaming at her to drive that threat away. When Harold was about halfway to the door, Bella charged. There was no warning, no preliminary stamp of her hooves or toss of her head. One moment she was standing still, and the next she was hurtling toward him like a freight train. Harold threw himself to the side, rolling across the hay-covered floor as Bella's massive body thundered past him. Her shoulder caught him a glancing blow that sent him spinning, and he crashed into a stack of hay bales with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. Gasping for air, Harold scrambled to his feet just as Bella wheeled around for another pass. This time, he had nowhere to go. The hay bales blocked his retreat on one side, and the wall of the stall blocked him on the other. Bella advanced slowly now, her hooves striking the ground in a deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of Harold's heart. She was not charging blindly anymore. She was cornering him, cutting off his escape routes, and preparing to deliver the final blow that would remove the threat to her foal once and for all. Harold pressed his back against the hay bales and raised his hands in front of him, a pathetic gesture of surrender that he knew would mean nothing to the enraged mare. "Bella, please," he begged, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "I have known you for 8 years. You know me. You know I would never hurt Copper." But Bella's eyes held no recognition, no trace of the bond they had shared for nearly a decade. All Harold could see in those dark depths was the fierce, unyielding love of a mother for her child. A love that had temporarily erased everything else. Then, just as Bella reared up again, her front hooves poised to come crashing down on Harold's skull, a sound cut through the tension like a knife. It was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it stopped Bella in her tracks, as surely as if she had been struck by lightning. It was Copper. The sick foal had lifted his head from the blanket and was looking at his mother with eyes that, despite their illness, still held a spark of awareness. He let out another soft nicker, a sound that seemed to reach something deep within Bella's heart. The mare's hooves came down slowly, settling on the ground inches from Harold's trembling bodies. For a moment, she stood there, her head turned toward her foal, her breath coming in great shuddering gasps. Then, as if waking from a dream, she blinked and took a step back. The wildness in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. She turned fully toward Copper and walked back to where he lay, lowering her massive head to nuzzle his face with a gentleness that seemed impossible given her ferocity just moments before. Harold remained frozen against the hay bales, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. He watched as Bella stood over Copper, her body forming a protective arch above his prone form. The foal's eyes had closed again, and his breathing was still labored, but for now, at least, he was alive. And so was Harold. The farmer looked down at his hands and saw that they were shaking uncontrollably. His shoulder throbbed where he had hit the wall, and his ribs ached from the impact with the hay bales. But he was alive. By some miracle, he was still alive. As the adrenaline began to fade, Harold realized that his simple plan to separate Mare from Foal had very nearly gotten him killed. He needed help. He needed someone who understood horses the way he did. Someone who might have an idea of how to get through to Bella without putting anyone else in danger. And he knew exactly who to call. Harold remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, his back pressed against the hay bales and his eyes fixed on Bella. The mare had returned to her vigil over Copper, her massive body positioned protectively above the ailing foal. Every few seconds, she would lower her head to sniff at him, then raise it again to scan the barn for any sign of danger. Harold knew that if he made any sudden movements, if he did anything that Bella perceived as a threat, she would be on him again in an instant. So he waited, barely breathing, until he saw his chance. It came when Bella turned her attention fully to Copper, nuzzling his neck and nickering softly in what Harold could only describe as a mother's lullaby. Moving with agonizing slowness, he began to inch his way along the wall of the barn toward the door. Each step felt like a mile, and with each step, he expected to hear the thunder of Bella's hooves behind him. But the mare remained focused on her foal, and after what seemed like hours but was probably only a few minutes, Harold finally reached the barn door and slipped outside into the morning light. The moment the door closed behind him, Harold's legs gave out. He collapsed against the weathered wood, gasping for breath and fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm him. His body was a symphony of pain, every muscle aching from the ordeal he had just survived. But beneath the physical discomfort, there was something else, a profound sense of awe at the depth of Bella's devotion to her foal. He had always known that horses were capable of deep emotional bonds, but what he had witnessed in that barn was something beyond anything he had ever experienced. Bella was not just protecting Copper. She was willing to die for him, to kill for him, to do whatever it took to keep him safe. After a few minutes, Harold managed to pull himself to his feet and stumbled toward the farmhouse. His wife Margaret was in the kitchen when he came through the door, and the look on her face when she saw him told Harold exactly how bad he must look. His shirt was torn, his hair was full of hay, and there was a bruise already forming on his cheek where he had hit the floor. Margaret rushed to him, her hands fluttering over his injuries as she peppered him with questions. "What happened? Are you all right? Was it Bella?" Harold answered as best he could, but his mind was already elsewhere. He needed to make a phone call. The person Harold had in mind was a woman named Elena Vasquez, a horse behaviorist who had earned a reputation throughout the region for her almost supernatural ability to communicate with troubled horses. Harold had met her 5 years ago at a livestock auction, where she had calmed a panicked stallion that 3 men had been unable to control. He had been so impressed that he had hired her to work with one of his own horses, a young mare with a fear of trailers that had made transportation nearly impossible. Elena had solved the problem in a single afternoon, using techniques that Harold had never seen before. If anyone could help him reach Bella, it was her. The phone rang 3 times before Elena answered, her voice carrying the slight accent that hinted at her Mexican heritage. "Harold Benson," she said warmly, recognizing his number. "It has been too long. How can I help you?" Harold took a deep breath and began to explain the situation. He told her about Copper's illness, about Bella's increasingly aggressive behavior, and about the terrifying encounter he had just survived in the barn. Elena listened without interrupting, and when Harold finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "This is not unusual behavior for a mare with a sick foal," Elena said thoughtfully. "The maternal instinct in horses is incredibly powerful, and when a foal is in danger, that instinct can override everything else, including the mare's relationship with her human handlers. Bella is not trying to hurt you, Harold. She is trying to protect her baby. She does not understand that you are trying to help." Harold nodded, even though Elena could not see him. "That is exactly what I thought," he said. "But I do not know what to do. Copper is getting worse, and if I cannot separate him from Bella long enough to treat him, he might not survive." Elena was quiet for another moment, and Harold could almost hear her thinking through the phone. "I will come to your farm today," she said finally. "But I want you to understand something, Harold. What you are asking me to do is not simple. Bella is operating on pure instinct right now, and instinct is the hardest thing to work against. I cannot promise you that I will be able to help, but I will try." Harold felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." While Harold waited for Elena to arrive, he made his way to the kitchen window that overlooked the barn. From there, he could see the large sliding door that he had closed behind him, and beyond it, he knew, Bella was still standing guard over Copper. Margaret came to stand beside him, wrapping her arm around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder. "She is a good mother," Margaret said quietly, "even if she does not show it the right way." Harold nodded, his eyes never leaving the barn. "That is what scares me," he admitted. "A good mother will do anything to protect her child. And right now, Bella thinks I am the enemy." The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Harold busied himself with small tasks around the house, but his mind was never far from the barn and the two horses inside. Every now and then, he would hear Bella's whinny carrying across the yard, and each time his heart would clench with worry. Was Copper getting worse? Was Bella becoming more agitated? He wanted desperately to go back to the barn, to check on the foal and make sure he was still breathing, but he knew that doing so would only make things worse. All he could do was wait and hope that Elena would arrive before it was too late. It was just past noon when Harold saw Elena's truck coming up the long dirt driveway that led to the farm. He was out the door before she had even come to a complete stop, his feet carrying him across the yard with a speed that surprised him given the soreness in his muscles. Elena stepped out of the truck, a tall woman in her mid-40s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes, dark and knowing, took in Harold's appearance with a single glance. "You look like you have been through a war," she observed. Harold managed a weak smile. "You have no idea," he replied. Elena walked toward the barn with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades earning the trust of frightened animals. Harold followed a few steps behind, his anxiety growing with each passing moment. He had told Elena everything he could think of about Bella, her history, her temperament, her relationship with Copper, but he knew that no amount of description could truly prepare her for what awaited inside. As they approached the barn door, Elena held up her hand, signaling Harold to stop. "I need you to wait here," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the weathered wood. "I know you want to help, but right now, your presence will only complicate things. Bella associates you with the threat to her foal. If she sees you, she will be on the defensive before I even have a chance to reach her." Harold wanted to protest, to insist that he should be there to help, but he knew Elena was right. He had already proven that his presence only made Bella more aggressive. So he nodded reluctantly and stepped back, positioning himself near the corner of the barn where he could see through a gap in the wooden slats without being seen himself. From this vantage point, he would be able to watch Elena work and intervene if something went terribly wrong. Not that he had any idea what he could do if that happened, but the thought of simply standing by while another person put themselves in danger was more than he could bear. Elena approached the barn door with slow, deliberate movements. She did not reach for the handle right away. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes closed and her breathing deep and even. Harold had seen her do this before, years ago when she had worked with his trailer-shy mare. She had explained that horses were incredibly sensitive to energy, to the unspoken signals that humans broadcast through their body language and their emotional state. Before she could hope to communicate with a frightened or aggressive horse, she needed to calm her own mind, to project an aura of peace and safety that the animal could sense. After several minutes of this silent meditation, Elena opened her eyes and gently slid the barn door open just wide enough to slip inside. Harold pressed his face against the gap in the wall, his heart pounding as he watched her enter the dim interior. For a moment, he could not see anything. Then his eyes adjusted to the shadows, and he spotted Bella, still standing over Copper, in the same protective stance she had maintained all morning. The mare's head swung toward Elena the moment she entered, and Harold saw her ears flatten against her skull in warning. But Elena did not react to the threat. She simply stood just inside the door, her arms relaxed at her sides, and her gaze directed slightly downward, avoiding direct eye contact with the agitated mare. Harold knew from his own experience that staring directly at a horse could be perceived as a challenge, a predatory behavior that would only escalate the situation. Elena was doing everything in her power to appear non-threatening, to communicate through her body language that she was not a danger to Bella or her foal. The seconds stretched into minutes as the two figures remained frozen in their positions. Bella's nostrils flared as she took in Elena's scent, trying to determine whether this new human posed a threat. Harold found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own respiration might somehow disturb the delicate balance Elena was trying to establish. Then, almost imperceptibly, Bella's ears began to relax. They did not come fully forward, but they were no longer pinned flat against her head. It was a small change, but Harold recognized it as a sign that Elena's approach was working. Moving with glacial slowness, Elena began to walk in a wide arc around the stall, keeping as much distance between herself and Bella as the confined space would allow. She was not approaching the mare directly. Instead, she was circling, allowing Bella to observe her from multiple angles and to become accustomed to her presence. Every few steps, Elena would pause and breathe deeply, reinforcing the calm energy she was projecting. And with each pause, Harold noticed that Bella's posture became slightly less rigid, her muscles slightly less coiled for attack. It took nearly half an hour for Elena to complete her circuit of the barn. By the time she returned to her starting position near the door, something remarkable had happened. Bella was no longer watching her with suspicion. Instead, the mare had turned her attention back to Copper, though she still positioned her body between the foal and Elena. It wasn't complete trust, not by any means, but it was a beginning. Elena had established herself as something other than a threat, and that was more than Harold had been able to accomplish in 3 days of trying. From his position outside the barn, Harold watched as Elena slowly lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged on the hay-covered floor. She did not move toward Bella or Copper. She simply sat there, her hands resting on her knees and her eyes half closed, in meditation. Harold did not understand what she was doing, but he trusted her methods. He had seen the results of her work before, and he knew that there was a wisdom in her approach that went beyond anything he had learned in his decades of raising horses. The afternoon wore on, and still Elena sat motionless on the barn floor. Harold's legs grew tired from standing, and his shoulder throbbed with increasing intensity. But he did not move from his position. He was witnessing something extraordinary, a silent conversation between human and animal that transcended the barriers of species. Bella, for her part, seemed to gradually accept Elena's presence. The mare would occasionally glance in her direction, but there was no longer any aggression in her gaze. Instead, there was something that looked almost like curiosity, as if Bella was trying to understand this strange human who made no demands and posed no threats. As the shadows began to lengthen and the light filtering through the barn walls turned golden with the approaching sunset, Elena finally stirred. She rose to her feet with the same slow, deliberate movements she had used throughout the day, and then she did something that made Harold's breath catch in his throat. She began walking toward Bella, not in a wide arc this time, but directly, step by careful step. Harold's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was the moment of truth. Either Elena had earned Bella's trust, or she was about to face the same fury that had nearly killed him that morning. Harold watched through the gap in the barn wall, his heart hammering against his ribs as Elena continued her slow approach toward Bella. The mare had lifted her head, her dark eyes fixed on the woman who was now only a few feet away. Harold could see the tension in Bella's muscles, the way her weight had shifted slightly onto her hindquarters in preparation for either flight or fight. One wrong move, one gesture that Bella interpreted as threatening, and Elena would be in the same danger Harold had faced that morning. But Elena did not falter. She kept walking, her steps small and measured, her breathing steady and calm. When Elena was close enough to touch Bella, she stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Elena extended her hand, not toward Bella's face or neck, but toward her shoulder, a less threatening area that horses typically tolerated being touched. Harold held his breath as Elena's fingers made contact with Bella's copper-colored coat. The mare flinched at the first touch, her skin rippling beneath Elena's palm. But she did not rear or charge. She stood perfectly still, every muscle in her body taut with uncertainty, as Elena began to stroke her shoulder in slow, circular motions. The transformation was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. With each passing minute, Bella's rigid posture began to soften. Her head, which had been held high and alert, gradually lowered until her muzzle was nearly touching the ground. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of Elena's gentle strokes. And then, in a moment that brought tears to Harold's eyes, Bella let out a long, shuddering sigh, the kind of breath a horse releases when they finally feel safe enough to let go of their tension. Elena had done it. She had broken through the wall of fear and aggression that had seemed impenetrable just hours before. But Elena was not finished. Still maintaining her connection with Bella through the steady pressure of her hand, she began to move slowly around the mare's body, positioning herself closer to where Copper lay on the blanket. Harold tensed, knowing that this was the most dangerous part of the process. Bella might have accepted Elena's presence near herself, but approaching the sick foal was another matter entirely. The maternal instinct that had driven Bella to attack Harold was still there, still coiled beneath the surface, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Elena seemed to sense the danger as well. She did not move directly toward Copper. Instead, she continued to stroke Bella's side, her hand traveling slowly along the mare's flank as she eased herself into a position where she could see the foal without appearing to approach him. Bella's head turned to follow Elena's movements, her ears swiveling back and forth as she monitored this new development. Harold could see the conflict playing out in the mare's eyes, the war between her desire to trust this calm, gentle human and her overwhelming need to protect her baby. For several agonizing minutes, the standoff continued. Elena stood motionless, her hand resting lightly on Bella's hip, while the mare decided whether to allow her closer to Copper. Harold found himself silently praying, not to any particular god, but to the universe itself, begging for Bella to make the right choice. And then, almost imperceptibly, the mare took a small step to the side. It was not much, just enough to create a narrow gap between her body and the wall of the stall, but it was an invitation, a sign that Bella was willing to let Elena approach her foal. Elena moved through the gap with exquisite care, never breaking contact with Bella's body as she positioned herself next to Copper. The foal looked even worse than he had that morning, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes closed, and his body limp against the blanket. Elena knelt beside him, her free hand reaching out to touch his neck and feel the rapid flutter of his pulse. Harold saw her brow furrow with concern, and his heart sank. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who was not sure if they had arrived in time. But Elena did not give up. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small vial, the medication that Dr. Martinez had prescribed for Copper's respiratory infection. Harold had given her the vial before she entered the barn, explaining what needed to be done and how to administer it. Now, with Bella watching every move, Elena uncapped the vial and carefully measured out the correct dosage. The foal did not resist as she gently opened his mouth and administered the medicine. He was too weak, too far gone to put up any fight. All Harold could do was hope that the medication would work, that it would give Copper the strength he needed to keep fighting. As Elena finished administering the medication, something unexpected happened. Bella, who had been watching the entire process with wary eyes, suddenly stepped forward. Harold's heart leaped into his throat, and he was about to cry out a warning when he realized that Bella was not attacking. Instead, the mare lowered her massive head and began to nuzzle Copper's face, her soft lips brushing against his cheek, in a gesture of pure maternal tenderness. It was as if she understood what Elena had done, as if she recognized that this human had come not to harm her baby, but to help him. Elena sat back on her heels, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she watched the reunion between mother and foal. She did not try to touch Bella again or to interfere with the moment. She simply observed, bearing witness to a bond that transcended the boundaries of human understanding. Harold, too, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life around horses, and he had seen countless displays of maternal affection. But there was something different about this, something sacred that made him feel like an intruder on a private moment between two souls. After what seemed like an eternity, Elena rose to her feet and began to make her way back toward the barn door. Bella watched her go, but made no move to follow or to block her path. The trust that Elena had worked so hard to establish held firm, even as she put distance between herself and the mare. When she finally reached the door and slipped outside into the fading light of evening, Harold was there to meet her. His face was a mask of emotion, relief, and gratitude, and fear, all warring for dominance. "How is he?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena met his gaze, her expression serious, but not without hope. Elena took a deep breath before answering Harold's question, her eyes reflecting the weight of what she had witnessed inside the barn. "He is very sick," she said softly, choosing her words with care. "The infection has progressed significantly, and his body is weak from days of not eating properly. The medication I gave him should help, but it is going to take time. And honestly, Harold, I cannot promise you that he will make it." Harold nodded, the answer confirming the fears that had been gnawing at him since Copper first showed signs of illness. He had raised enough animals in his lifetime to know that sometimes, despite every effort, nature had other plans. But he also knew that giving up was not an option, not while Copper was still breathing, not while Bella was still fighting for her baby. "What about Bella?" Harold asked, glancing toward the barn where the mare remained with her foal. "Will she let us continue treating him?" Elena considered the question for a moment before responding. "I believe so," she said, "but it is going to require patience and consistency. Bella has accepted that I am not a threat, but that trust is fragile. Any sudden movements, any sign of aggression or fear, and she could revert to her protective behavior. I would recommend that I stay here for the next few days, at least until Copper shows signs of improvement. That way, I can administer his medication and monitor his progress without triggering Bella's defensive instincts." Harold did not hesitate. "Of course," he said immediately. "We have a guest room in the house, and Margaret will be happy to have you. Whatever you need, Elena, just name it. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for what you have done today." Elena smiled, a tired but genuine expression that softened her weathered features. "Do not thank me yet," she cautioned. "We still have a long way to go, but I have seen something in Bella today that gives me hope. She loves that foal more than anything in the world, and that love is a powerful thing. If we can work with it instead of against it, we might just be able to save Copper." The next few days fell into a rhythm that revolved entirely around the barn. Elena would enter each morning at dawn, spending hours sitting quietly with Bella before approaching Copper to administer his medication. Harold watched from his usual position outside the barn, his anxiety gradually giving way to something like wonder as he observed Elena's methods. She never raised her voice, never made sudden movements, never did anything that might alarm the vigilant mare. And with each passing day, Bella seemed to grow more comfortable with her presence, even going so far as to allow Elena to touch Copper without positioning herself between them. On the third day, something miraculous happened. Harold was at his observation post when he saw movement from inside the barn. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dim light, but as he peered more closely through the gap in the wall, his heart nearly stopped. Copper was trying to stand. The foal's legs were shaky and uncertain, his body swaying dangerously as he attempted to push himself up from the blanket. Bella stood over him, her head lowered and her body positioned to catch him if he fell. And Elena was there too, watching from a respectful distance, her face alight with hope. It took several attempts, but Copper finally managed to get his legs under him. He stood there, trembling but upright, for nearly a full minute before his strength gave out, and he collapsed back onto the blanket. But that minute was enough. It was proof that the medication was working, that Copper's body was beginning to fight back against the infection that had nearly claimed his life. Harold felt tears streaming down his face, and he did not bother to wipe them away. He had witnessed many things in his years on the farm, but nothing had ever moved him quite like this. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elena joined Harold and Margaret on the farmhouse porch for dinner. It was the first time since her arrival that Elena had taken a break from her vigil, and Harold could see the exhaustion etched into her features. But there was also a light in her eyes, a spark of satisfaction that came from knowing her work was making a difference. "He is going to make it," Elena said between bites of Margaret's homemade stew. "I was not sure at first, but after today, I believe Copper is going to pull through. His body is responding to the medication, and more importantly, his spirit is returning. Did you see the way he looked at Bella when he stood up? There was life in those eyes, Harold. Real life. Harold nodded, his own spirits lifted by Elena's words. I saw it, he confirmed. And I saw something else too. I saw Bella. She was not just standing there watching. She was helping him, supporting him, willing him to get up. I have never seen anything like it. Elena set down her spoon and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the barn in the distance. That is the power of a mother's love, she said quietly. It is the same in every species, Harold. A mother will move mountains for her child. She will fight. She will sacrifice. She will do whatever it takes to give her baby a chance at life. What you witnessed in that barn today was not just a mare helping her foal stand. It was love in its purest, most primal form. Margaret, who had been listening quietly throughout the conversation, reached over and took Harold's hand. She squeezed it gently, and when he looked at her, he saw that her eyes were glistening with tears. "We almost lost you in that barn," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "When you came through that door looking the way you did, I thought my heart would stop. Promise me you will never put yourself in danger like that again." Harold lifted his wife's hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. "I cannot promise that," he admitted. "Not when there are animals depending on me. But I can promise that I will be more careful, that I will not underestimate the power of a mother's love ever again." The three of them sat in companionable silence as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. In the barn, Bella stood watch over her sleeping foal, her massive body a shield against the darkness that pressed in from all sides. She did not know that her ferocity had nearly killed the man who had cared for her for 8 years. She did not understand the complex web of emotions that surrounded her actions. All Bella knew was that her baby was still alive, still breathing, still fighting. And as long as that was true, she would remain by his side, a guardian angel wrapped in muscle and sinew, ready to face whatever threats the world might send her way. The days that followed brought steady improvement to Copper's condition. Each morning, Elena would find the foal a little stronger than the day before, a little more alert, a little more willing to engage with the world around him. By the 5th day, Copper was standing on his own for extended periods, his legs no longer trembling beneath his weight. By the 7th day, he was taking tentative steps around the stall, his movements clumsy but determined. And through it all, Bella remained his constant companion, never straying more than a few feet from his side. Harold marveled at the transformation he was witnessing. The foal who had seemed so close to death just a week ago was now showing all the signs of a healthy young horse. His eyes, once dull and listless, now sparkled with curiosity. His coat, which had grown matted and rough during his illness, was beginning to regain its natural sheen, and his appetite had returned with a vengeance, as if his body was trying to make up for all the meals he had missed during his battle with the infection. Elena continued to administer his medication twice daily, but even she admitted that the worst was behind them. Copper was going to make it, and Bella's unwavering devotion had played no small part in his recovery. But as Copper grew stronger, Harold began to notice a change in Bella as well. The fierce protectiveness that had defined her behavior for the past week was slowly giving way to something softer, something more relaxed. She still watched over Copper constantly, still positioned herself between him and any potential threats. But the wild desperation in her eyes had faded. In its place was a calm confidence, the quiet assurance of a mother who knew her child was safe. It was as if Bella could sense that the danger had passed, that the crisis that had threatened her foal's life was finally over. One morning, About 10 days after Copper's illness had first begun, Harold decided to test the waters. He approached the barn with his usual caution, but instead of stopping at the door, he continued inside, moving slowly and keeping his body language as non-threatening as possible. Bella looked up at his entrance, her ears swiveling forward to track his movements. Harold braced himself for the charge, for the flattened ears and bared teeth that had greeted him so many times before. But the attack never came. Instead, Bella simply watched him, her expression wary but not hostile. She was giving him a chance, allowing him to prove that he was not a threat. Harold took another step forward, then another, his heart pounding in his chest with each movement. He was now close enough to touch Copper, if he reached out his hand, close enough to feel Bella's warm breath on his skin. The mare's nostrils flared as she took in his scent, and for a moment, Harold was certain she was going to react. But then, almost imperceptibly, her posture relaxed. Her ears, which had been rigidly forward, softened to a more neutral position. And when Harold extended his hand toward Copper, she did not move to stop him. She simply stood there, watching, as the man who had cared for her for 8 years gently stroked her foal's neck for the first time since the illness began. The moment was brief, lasting only a few seconds before Harold withdrew his hand and stepped back. But in those few seconds, something profound had shifted. The trust that had been shattered by Copper's illness was beginning to rebuild, the bond between human and horse slowly knitting itself back together. Harold looked at Bella, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. She remembered him. She remembered the years of care, the countless hours of grooming and feeding and quiet companionship. And she was choosing, however tentatively, to trust him again. Elena, who had been watching from the doorway, smiled at the scene before her. "You have a special connection with her, Harold," she said softly. "It is clear that she loves you, even if she did not show it during the crisis. Horses are like people in that way. When someone they love is in danger, they can become someone else entirely, someone driven by fear and instinct rather than reason. But once the danger passes, they return to who they truly are. And Bella, at her core, is a gentle soul who trusts the humans in her life." Harold nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He had known Bella for 8 years, had seen her through good times and bad, had celebrated her triumphs and mourned her losses. But he had never truly understood the depth of her capacity for love until now. As the weeks passed and Copper continued to thrive, life on the Benson farm gradually returned to normal. Harold resumed his daily routines, caring for his horses, and tending to the endless tasks that came with running a working farm. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, preparing meals and managing the household with the quiet efficiency that had defined her for their entire marriage. And Elena, her work complete, packed up her truck and prepared to return to her own life, though not before extracting a promise from Harold that he would call her if he ever needed help again. The day Elena left, Harold walked her to her truck, his hand extended in a handshake that quickly became a hug. "I cannot thank you enough," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved Copper's life, and you probably saved mine too. If I had kept trying to separate him from Bella on my own, I do not want to think about what might have happened." Elena returned the embrace, then stepped back and placed her hands on Harold's shoulders. "You saved them both," she corrected gently. "All I did was help you find a way to do it. The love you have for those horses, the dedication you show to their well-being, that is what saved Copper. Never forget that, Harold. You are a good man, and your horses are lucky to have you." Harold watched as Elena's truck disappeared down the long driveway, a cloud of dust marking its passage. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, where Bella and Copper were waiting. The mare nickered softly as he approached, a sound of greeting that warmed Harold's heart. He reached out and stroked her neck, marveling at the silky smoothness of her coat beneath his fingers. "We made it, girl," he murmured. "We made it through." The summer months brought warmth and abundance to the Benson farm, and with them came the full recovery of young Copper. The foal who had once lain so still on that blanket, his life hanging by a thread, was now a bundle of boundless energy who seemed determined to make up for lost time. He would race across the pastures with his tail held high, his legs churning beneath him in a blur of motion that made Harold laugh out loud. Sometimes Bella would join him in his runs, her massive body moving with a grace that belied her size, and the two of them would thunder across the fields together like something out of a painting. Harold would lean against the fence and watch them, his heart full to bursting with gratitude for the second chance they had all been given. But even as life returned to normal, Harold found himself changed by the experience. The near-death encounter in the barn had left its mark on him, not in the form of physical scars, though his shoulder still ached on rainy days, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. He had always respected horses, had always understood that they were powerful creatures deserving of careful handling, but he had never truly feared one until Bella, and that fear, rather than diminishing his love for her, had somehow deepened it. He understood now that Bella's ferocity had not been a betrayal of their relationship, but an expression of it. She had been willing to fight anyone, even him, to protect her child. And that kind of love, that absolute, unconditional devotion, was something Harold could not help but admire. Margaret noticed the change in her husband, the way he would pause sometimes while watching the horses, his eyes distant and thoughtful. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set behind the rolling hills, she asked him what he was thinking about. Harold was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I keep thinking about that morning," he said finally. "The morning Bella almost killed me. I was so scared, Margaret, more scared than I have ever been in my life. But at the same time, there was a part of me that understood why she was doing it. She was not attacking me because she hated me. She was attacking me because she loved Copper more than anything else in the world, and I cannot fault her for that." Margaret reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "That is because you are a good man," she said softly. "A lesser person might have held a grudge, might have sold Bella off or worse. But you understood that she was just being a mother, and that says more about your character than anything else could." Harold squeezed his wife's hand, grateful as always for her steadfast presence in his life. They had been married for nearly 40 years, and in all that time, Margaret had been his rock, his anchor, his constant companion through every storm. He could not imagine facing the challenges of farm life without her by his side. As the summer wore on, Harold began to notice something else about Bella's behavior. The mare, who had always been somewhat aloof with the other horses on the farm, was becoming more social. She would stand at the fence line and nicker to the horses in the adjacent pasture, engaging in the complex social rituals that defined equine relationships. She allowed the farm dogs to approach without pinning her ears, and she even tolerated the barn cats, who would occasionally curl up in the hay near her stall. It was as if the crisis with Copper had opened something inside her, had unlocked a capacity for connection that had been dormant for years. Dr. Martinez, who continued to visit the farm periodically to check on Copper's progress, remarked on the change during one of his visits. "I have never seen anything quite like it," he admitted, watching as Bella grazed peacefully alongside a gelding she had previously ignored. "It is almost like she is grateful, like she understands on some level that the humans around her helped save her foal." I know that sounds anthropomorphic, and I am not saying horses experience gratitude the way we do, but there is definitely something different about her now. Something softer. Harold nodded, understanding exactly what the veterinarian meant. He had spent enough time around horses to know that they were capable of far more emotional complexity than most people gave them credit for. The bond between Bella and Copper, already strong before the illness, seemed to deepen even further in the months that followed. The mare was never far from her foal, watching over him with the same vigilance she had displayed during his sickness, though now without the desperate edge that had made her so dangerous. When Copper would venture too far from her side, she would call him back with a series of low nickers, and he would always respond, trotting back to her with an expression that seemed almost sheepish. It was a dynamic that Harold found endlessly fascinating, a window into the complex social and emotional lives of these magnificent animals. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves were just beginning to turn, and there was a crispness in the air that hinted at the coming winter, Harold made his way to the pasture where Bella and Copper were grazing. He had brought apples, a treat that both horses loved, and he stood at the fence holding them out in his weathered hands. Copper spotted him first and came bounding over, his gangly legs carrying him with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of youth. He snatched an apple from Harold's hand and crunched it loudly, juice dribbling down his chin. Harold laughed and reached out to stroke the foal's face, marveling at how much he had grown since those dark days in the barn. Then Bella approached, her movement slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on Harold's face. For a moment, he felt a flicker of the old fear, a ghost of the terror that had gripped him during their confrontation. But then Bella reached out and gently took the apple from his hand, her soft lips brushing against his palm. She chewed thoughtfully, never breaking eye contact with Harold. And when she was done, she did something that took his breath away. She lowered her massive head and pressed her forehead against his chest, holding it there for several long seconds in a gesture of unmistakable affection. Harold stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, as the mare who had almost killed him offered her forgiveness and her love. Harold stood there for what felt like an eternity. Bella's forehead pressed against his chest, her warm breath soaking through his shirt. He did not move, did not dare to break the spell of this moment. All the fear, all the pain, all the uncertainty of the past months seemed to dissolve in that simple gesture of connection. When Bella finally lifted her head, Harold reached up and stroked her face, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of her cheek and jaw. "Welcome back, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I missed you." Bella nickered softly in response, and Harold could have sworn he saw something like relief in her dark eyes. They had come through the fire together, human and horse, and they had emerged on the other side with a bond stronger than either of them could have imagined. Word of what had happened on the Benson farm began to spread through the local community. At first, it was just whispered conversations at the feed store and the livestock auction, tales of a mare who had nearly killed her owner while protecting her sick foal. But as the story grew, it took on a life of its own. People began driving out to the farm just to catch a glimpse of Bella and Copper, the mare who had fought like a demon, and the foal who had cheated death. Harold was uncomfortable with the attention at first, preferring to keep his personal life private. But Margaret convinced him that there was value in sharing their experience, that it might help other horse owners understand the depths of equine emotion and the importance of approaching protective mares with caution. So Harold began to tell his story, first to neighbors and friends, then to local horse clubs, and eventually to anyone who would listen. He spoke of the terror he had felt in the barn that morning, of the moment when he was certain Bella was going to end his life. But he also spoke of the love he had witnessed, the fierce, unconditional devotion of a mother for her child. He talked about Elena and the patience and skill she had brought to the situation, about the long days of recovery, and the joy of watching Copper grow stronger. And always, he ended with the same message. "Never underestimate the power of a mother's love," he would say, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "It can move mountains, it can break down walls, and yes, it can almost kill you. But it is also the most beautiful force in the world, and we are privileged to witness it." The story reached Elena, who called Harold one evening to tell him how moved she had been to hear that he was sharing their experience. "You are doing important work," she told him. "Too many people see horses as simple animals, as creatures without complex emotions or deep bonds. But you know better, Harold. You have seen what Bella is capable of, both the darkness and the light. By sharing your story, you are helping others understand that horses deserve our respect and our compassion." Harold thanked her for her kind words, but he knew that he could never have told this story without her. Elena had been the bridge between him and Bella, the translator who had helped them find their way back to each other. As autumn deepened into winter, Harold began to think about the future. Copper was now nearly 8 months old, and it would soon be time to begin weaning him from Bella. It was a natural process, one that Harold had overseen countless times with other mares and foals, but this time felt different. After everything Bella and Copper had been through together, the thought of separating them seemed almost cruel. Harold discussed his concerns with Dr. Martinez, who assured him that the weaning process, while stressful for both mare and foal, was necessary for Copper's development. "He will always have a bond with his mother," the veterinarian explained, "but he needs to learn to be independent, to form relationships with other horses and humans. Bella knows this instinctively, even if it is hard for her to let go." Harold decided to take a gradual approach to the weaning, separating Bella and Copper for short periods at first, and then lengthening the time apart as both horses adjusted. The first separation was difficult, with Bella pacing the fence line and calling for her foal, and Copper responding with plaintive whinnies that tugged at Harold's heart. But with each passing day, the separations became easier. Bella began to relax, spending more time grazing and less time watching for her son. And Copper, for his part, started forming bonds with the other young horses on the farm, engaging in the play and social interaction that would shape his development into adulthood. By the time spring arrived, the weaning was complete. Copper had grown into a handsome young horse, his coat a rich chestnut that reminded Harold of autumn leaves. He had inherited his mother's intelligence and her proud bearing, but there was a gentleness in him too, a softness that Harold attributed to the love and care he had received during his illness. Bella, meanwhile, had returned to her role as the queen of the stable, respected by the other horses and beloved by the humans who cared for her. She still kept an eye on Copper from across the pasture, and occasionally the two of them would graze together, their heads close in silent communion. But the fierce protectiveness of those dark days was gone, replaced by a calm acceptance of the natural order of things. One morning, as Harold was making his rounds of the farm, he stopped to watch Bella and Copper standing together in the early light. The mare was grooming her son, her teeth gently working through his mane, while he stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed in contentment. It was a scene of such simple beauty that Harold felt his breath catch in his throat. He thought about everything they had been through, the fear and the pain, the moments when he had been certain that death was inches away. And he thought about the love that had driven it all, the love of a mother for her child, a love so powerful it could transform a gentle mare into a raging protector, and then back again. Harold leaned against the fence, a smile spreading across his weathered face. He had learned many lessons in his 62 years on this earth, but none more profound than the one Bella had taught him. Love was not always gentle. Sometimes it was fierce and frightening, willing to destroy anything that threatened those it held dear. But that ferocity was not a flaw. It was a testament to the depth of the bond, a measure of how much one soul could care for another. Years passed on the Benson farm, each season bringing its own rhythms and routines. Harold's hair grew whiter, his steps a little slower, but his love for his horses never diminished. Copper grew into a magnificent stallion, his chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight as he galloped across the pastures that had been his home since birth. He had his mother's spirit and his own gentle nature, a combination that made him beloved by everyone who encountered him. Breeders from across the state came to inquire about him, offering substantial sums for the chance to add his bloodline to their herds. But Harold always refused. Copper was not for sale. He never would be. Bella aged gracefully, her once vibrant copper coat now flecked with gray around her muzzle and eyes. She moved more slowly than she once had, preferring to spend her days grazing in the sunny corners of the pasture rather than racing across the fields. But her eyes still held that same intelligence, that same depth of emotion that had always set her apart. And when Copper would approach her, lowering his head in a gesture of respect and affection, she would nicker softly and groom him just as she had when he was a foal. Some bonds, Harold had learned, were not diminished by time. They only grew stronger. The story of what had happened in that barn continued to circulate through the horse community, growing with each telling until it had achieved almost legendary status. People spoke of the giant mare who had nearly killed her owner, of the sick foal who had been saved by a combination of modern medicine and maternal love. Harold was sometimes asked to speak at equine events, sharing his experience with audiences who listened in rapt attention. He always told the story the same way, with honesty and humility, never exaggerating the danger or downplaying his own fear. And he always ended with the same message, the lesson that Bella had seared into his heart on that terrifying morning. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, leaving Harold alone in the farmhouse for the first time in nearly 50 years. The grief was overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. For weeks, he moved through his days in a fog, performing his chores mechanically while his mind remained trapped in memories of his beloved wife. But it was Bella who finally pulled him back from the brink. One morning, as Harold stood at the fence staring at nothing, the old mare approached and pressed her forehead against his chest, just as she had done years ago after Copper's recovery. Harold wrapped his arms around her neck and wept, his tears soaking into her mane while she stood perfectly still, offering him the comfort of her presence. From that day forward, Harold spent more time in the barn and pastures than he did in the empty farmhouse. He would sit on an overturned bucket and talk to Bella for hours, telling her about Margaret, about their life together, about the love they had shared. The mare would listen with her ears forward, occasionally nickering softly as if in response. Harold knew that she could not understand his words, but he also knew that she understood something deeper, the emotion behind them, the need for connection that transcended language. In those moments, Human and horse were simply two souls keeping each other company in a world that could sometimes be unbearably lonely. It was a cold December morning when Harold found Bella lying down in her stall, her breathing shallow and labored. He knew immediately that this was different from her usual rest, that something fundamental had changed. Dr. Martinez came within the hour and confirmed what Harold already suspected. Bella's heart was failing, worn out after 26 years of faithful service. There was nothing to be done but keep her comfortable and wait for the end. Harold stayed with her through that long day and into the night, sitting beside her in the hay and stroking her neck while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Copper seemed to sense that something was wrong. He stood at the entrance to the stall, his head lowered and his eyes fixed on his mother. When Harold tried to lead him away, the stallion refused to move, planting his hooves and pulling against the halter. So Harold let him stay, understanding that Copper needed to be there just as much as he did. As the hours passed, Copper would occasionally approach Bella and nuzzle her face, his soft whinnies carrying a note of distress that broke Harold's heart. The bond between mother and son, forged in love and tested by crisis, remained unbroken even now at the end. Bella passed away just as the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. One moment she was there, her breath warm against Harold's hand, and the next she was gone, her great body finally at rest. Harold sat beside her for a long time, tears streaming down his face as he remembered everything they had shared. The day he had brought her home from Tennessee, her pregnancy and the birth of Copper, the terrifying morning when she had nearly killed him, and the beautiful afternoon when she had offered her forgiveness. All of it was part of the tapestry of his life, woven through with threads of love and loss and the profound connection between human and horse. They buried Bella on a hill overlooking the farm, in a spot where she could watch over the pastures she had ruled for so many years. Copper stood beside the grave as they lowered her body into the earth, his head bowed and his eyes as dark with grief. Harold placed a hand on the stallion's neck, drawing comfort from his warmth and solidity. "We will miss her, boy," he said softly, "but she will always be with us, always." In the years that followed, Harold would often walk up to that hill at sunset and stand beside Bella's grave. He would tell her about the farm, about Copper, about the new foals that arrived each spring, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, he would swear he could hear her nickering in response. Her voice carried across the veil between worlds. The story of Bella and Copper became part of the farm's legacy, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of love. And Harold, who had learned more about that power than most people ever would, carried it with him until the day he joined Margaret and Bella in whatever lay beyond.